an original.
From Story Studio Network.
The 2030 Project is a Story Studio Network podcast sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. What would it take to eliminate poverty in Canada by the year 2030? This is the 2030 Project. It's a podcast that explores why poverty persists and what we can do about it in this country. We endeavor to uncover what's been successful with Canada's poverty reduction strategy, but then what needs to come next? The 2030 Project tackles some of the biggest and the most pressing social issues facing this country today. I'm Dave Trafford, and thanks for joining us. All right, I think we've made it pretty clear already. The crisis is immediate. The call for action in this season of the 2030 Project is a call for immediate change. In the past two episodes, we discussed the heightened awareness of poverty in our midst. We explored our misconceptions of poverty and what it means to live in poverty. The growing number of food bank visits alone tell the story. More people are falling into poverty every month in Canada. Yes, it's a complex issue. But how long can we be patient? Our guest is Leila Sarangi, National Director of Campaign 2000. The group's aim is to end child and family poverty by the year 2000. Yeah, she landed the job just before the pandemic hit.
3 years exactly. I've been in the role for 3 years.
So you picked the best 3 years because you got to jump in there just before COVID and have to steer the ship through the storm.
That's right, exactly. But the coalition has been active for 30 years now, since the federal government promised back in 1989 to end child poverty by the year 2000. So that's where we get our name from.
Well, and it's facetious to say, so how's it going? Because clearly here we are in 2022, halfway through as we record this segment. And, you know, it's easy to be cynical, and that's my role. But, you know, tell me, because you have seen probably the worst that it has been in the last 20 years anyway, just considering what's happened with the pandemic, the number of families that suffer. Certainly that has had an effect on kids. Let's start with a question as to whether or not there's something hopeful here.
So I think that's a great question, and it's important to remain hopeful and keep that vision in our minds so we know what we're aiming for. I think one of the things that we've seen through the pandemic is that governments actually can move really quickly and invest a lot in individuals and families when it's needed. So what I'm talking about is when the economy shut down as a result of the public health measures, stay home, stay isolated, they rolled out some income benefit programs, transfers to families quite quickly. And preliminary data is showing that that's actually made a real difference in the rates of poverty and child poverty across the country. Those programs have all ended, and we don't have anything in their place now, and they weren't perfect. But I think what it did show us is that there is a way to do this. There is a way that we can bring up incomes and raise that income floor for families.
Yeah, and I do want to get into that a little bit. We're going to actually have a session just talk about the reckoning, because it's kind of where we are, right? It's just in terms of we saw what worked. And I have been saying this over the last 2.5 years now. We can never go back to using the phrase, we've always done it this way, because we can't go to the before times anymore.
No, we can't. And we can't be satisfied with relentless incrementalism either. I think that's another thing that I hear. Governments move slow. We have to be happy with those incremental approaches. But I think we can also now say, actually, we can ask for something more transformative and more quick.
Okay, and I do want to get to that, and I want to challenge you a little bit about on some of that, because the advocates that I have spoken to, certainly over the course of these two seasons of the 2030 Project, they're all deeply engaged in it for obviously the right reasons. There's no wrong reason to want to mitigate or reduce poverty, but the level of patience for me. I would not be able to do your job. I just would not have the patience to put up with because it just seems so obvious to me. And, maybe I haven't been paying enough attention, but as I've gone through these two series, it becomes more and more evident to me that our understanding of what poverty is incredibly skewed.
Yeah, it is. And I think for a long time we didn't have a share, and actually we don't still have a shared understanding of what poverty is. And so I think we need to kind of really think about what is it that we're talking about? Who are we talking about? And start from there, a bit of level setting, I guess.
Well, but again, we're not cheering for COVID here, but I think to your earlier point, that's what sort of happened, right? All of a sudden we looked around and we hear the statistics coming out of the food bank. Not 1.45 million number of visits in a calendar year. It's just an extraordinary, breathtaking number. And I've said this to Neil Hetherington when we talked about the report initially. That's a big number that is easy to ignore in many ways because it's so big.
Yeah, that's right. But we can't ignore that, right? Those are real people with real challenges that they're going through on the day to day. And I think, when you talk about people who are doing this work, that's, I think, what drives us every day is that we're in these communities working with these folks. And for me, it's like, I couldn't turn my back. I couldn't walk away. I have to keep coming back to this table and to this work because I really do believe, and I think Campaign 2000 really does believe and sees and puts forward a better pathway, a different way forward, a way that would actually get us to ending poverty, not even reducing it, right? We're advocating for actually eradicating poverty in Canada.
So to that point, and when we look at that path, there are a number of questions and issues that come up, and there are blinders or whatever you want to call them that we tend to have on it, because I still hear people ask the question, how can you be poor in this country? I mean, how come I don't see it? And the irony for me is I think it's organizations like Campaign 2000 and Daily Bread that are the reason we don't see it in many respects.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you say that because I think a big part of our work is the public education piece and putting, helping people get their stories out so that we can show like how difficult it is for folks. And I want to be clear on something here. This is about the way our systems are set up, right? That people are not poor because they want to be poor or they don't want to work. That's not why we have poverty in Canada. We have poverty in Canada because of we are still working under colonized system. We have specific communities that face systemic marginalization in terms of how they can access programs and services, the investments that are being made into those communities or not being made into those communities that perpetuate a cycle of poverty.
Okay, so when you talk about accessing the services, and the last time you were on in season 1, you were on with Ujwal Arkalgud. He's a cultural anthropologist, and we talked about more or less our scope of understanding of what, how we were going to treat poverty, and it got into this whole infrastructure conversation. For example, the need to address daycare as an infrastructure issue, an economic issue that we need to address in order to not just stimulate economy, but at the same time to provide some stability in families. And this is a key component in vis-a-vis, the level of poverty that we're seeing. But you kind of stopped me dead in my tracks when you said that, Canada is the only developed country that looks at poverty from a deprivation point. Can you just revisit that? Let's just reset that.
Yeah. So in 2018, the federal government released their poverty reduction strategy. It's called Opportunity for All. And in it, they identify what they call the official poverty line. So we've got a few different ways to measure poverty. And the federal government, after consulting with the public, chose a material deprivation measure. It's called the market basket measure. And it ask the question of, can a family or an individual afford their basic needs in the region that they live in? And they calculate, they being the federal government, calculates out, now there is 53 baskets across the provinces. So depending on where you live, if you're in an urban center or a rural center or a larger region or a smaller region, they've calculated out what it would cost to purchase a basket of goods and services. There's five categories that go into that basket. Those include shelter, transportation, clothing, food, and a basket of others, where now, something like your cell phone will go into that basket. And if they calculate that cost, then they calculate the individual or the family's disposable income. So they look at, some things that get deducted off your payroll that you don't have control over, and they look at what's left over, and then they look at, can you afford that basket of goods? It's really comparing someone's income to the material, the goods and services that they can buy. If you can afford that basket of goods with your disposable income, you're not living in poverty. If you can't, then you're said to be living in poverty. That's really looking at someone's material situation. It's interesting because the poverty reduction strategy is based on three pillars of opportunity, dignity, and resiliency. And usually when we're talking about poverty, the measure that we would use is a relative measure, a measure that looks at not only can I afford my basket in my neighborhood, but can I afford what my neighbors can afford? Do I have the same access to opportunities? Do I have the same access to my rights, right? To social opportunities, to inclusion? And there are measures that look at that. The low income measure is one. That's what Campaign 2000 uses in all of our data and analysis and our report cards. But the federal government has chosen this Made in Canada market basket measure that looks at material deprivation.
So I can see how people would look at that and say, well, that makes sense to me. I mean, if you can afford it, you can't afford it. That's all it costs, the general cost. There's some standard there. I can actually look at the data and say you can tick a box as we go through the various baskets. What's wrong with the system?
So it's a very, there's several things, several issues that arise when calculating these baskets. So the data that they use, first of all, that the government uses to calculate, comes from the Canada Income Survey. So it's a very small sample size. I believe it's about 500 or 700,000 people that they count in that. So it's subject to sampling error, a small sample size. It doesn't include, there's many groups who are excluded from the Canadian Income Survey. So people in the territories are not included, people living on First Nations, anybody living in congregate settings, group settings like institutions, hospitals, juvenile centers, foster care, are all excluded. But those groups of folks tend to have higher rates of poverty. So we're looking at a very small sample size that doesn't include groups that have high rates of poverty. On the other hand, if you look at the market basket measure, you can go onto Stats Canada website and you can look at all the individual things that are put into the basket. And it's pages upon pages of things that someone or some policy folks have decided what goes into that basket. And it doesn't take into consideration things like cultural differences, like different kinds of clothing and food. It's very, very prescriptive. For example, as a woman, I can buy one pair of nylons every 3 years. So it tells me exactly, and I have 3 kids and I can buy X liters of milk over a week. It just gets very, very prescriptive, and it's not necessarily reflective of the way we actually live.
So sorry, just on that then,
yeah.
Are those numbers then data driven or arbitrary?
So they are data driven. There's a process by which folks go out and do the shopping, and they'll compare at 3 different stores, and they'll take an average, and then annually it gets inflated it gets adjusted using the Canadian Consumer Index, the price index, the CPI. So it does go through this process of, it's actually a very complicated process. It's quite complicated to calculate this basket year over year. And what happens is the result is that the thresholds are lowered. So the threshold for poverty, the number that we're comparing to, is lower than, for example, what it would be using the low income measure. And it's making it look like poverty is reducing at a faster pace than what the low income measure calculated with a broader set of numbers would, a broader data set would make it look
so
like.
we're effectively defining poverty out of existence.
Yes, and colleagues of mine, actually, they call it invisibilizing poverty, and very specifically Indigenous poverty, because there's so Indigenous folks and people living in the territories are just not included. So we are not even counting them when we think about who is living in poverty and who needs access to services and programs, right? Then on the other hand, we're not going to necessarily be investing in those communities. We're just not talking about that.
Yeah. So, okay, I want to roll in some of the conversation that I had in the previous episode with Ujwal, our Kulgud. And as you recall, his brain goes to meaning. And that's why we included him and sort of broadened that discussion around infrastructure. And so I said to him, what are, from your perspective, our perceptions and our understanding of poverty? And that drives a lot of, I think, what you're talking about, in as much as there's a particular bias built in. And I use that phrase advisedly, but there is a bias there just because we have an understanding of what poverty is. And in the course of that conversation, it almost suggested to me that we're using the wrong language in order to communicate the problem. He talked about equity having a more of an effect on people in terms of an emotional impact on me. Privilege, using that phrase and framework for a discussion. Because as soon as we start to talk about poverty, I don't even think of something's happening in Canada. I'm beginning to think of third world deprivation and poverty. And again, I kind of go back to, I don't see that here. Are we using the wrong language to talk about this?
For me, I think sometimes that poverty and the way we think about poverty, it becomes about the individual. And so when we talk about privilege and equity and inclusion and those kinds of things, it does bring it back to the system and how are we including people in our society. I think it is important for people to realize that poverty does exist, that this is the day-to-day that a lot of people are facing. So our statistics show, the most recent data that we have, more than 1.3 million children are living in poverty. And I think it's really important to understand that these kids are going, to school without the right clothes, without food in their tummies, and who are living in overcrowded or housing that is in states of disrepair. I think it's important that we do take a look at our society, at the place we live, and see that, yeah, this is how some people are being treated. And when we disaggregate that data and look at who those folks are, it does clearly break down around, First Nations, Inuit, Métis folks have higher rates of poverty, immigrants, newcomers, racialized folks, Black communities. And this is because, again, of that, the way our systems are set up, where we're investing, who has access to our programs and services. I do agree that we need to talk about equity. It's the flip side of any kind of anti-poverty initiative. We can't end poverty without ending systemic inequality. Those two have to go hand in hand, really.
Well, whose role is that? Is that advocacy role, or is that a sort of a government perspective? Because it's very difficult for anyone, particularly, doing what you do, to be talking about equity and inclusivity and the effects of privilege when government is talking about poverty from a deprivation point of view. Yeah,
I think it's part of our role as educators to bring that to the table. In Campaign 2000, when we develop our policies, this is the way in which we develop and are driving towards that. And so in our work with government, we are always bringing that kind of analysis forward. There are ways, when the government's developing strategies, they need to invest in those strategies, but they are developing some solutions. Our focus at Campaign 2000 is about government intervention in these kinds of ways. So we do see that government does have a big role to play in advancing equity, in investing into anti-racism strategies and employment equity and calls to justice and truth and reconciliation, right? If we start investing robustly in those kinds of programs, we're going to start reducing poverty in those communities, which is where we should be starting, really.
So somebody had suggested to me, really kind of poignantly, I thought, that if you talk about poverty, particularly among kids, they framed it as such that it's as nuanced as the pressures of being invited to a birthday party, where I may not understand the dynamic or the circumstances in that family. The kids go to school together. I'm just going to invite all the kids in the class. There's pressure to come because, you know what, I can't afford a gift.
Yeah. I mean, and that's a real pressure, right? Not only can I not afford a gift, I may not be able to reciprocate by having a birthday party for my kid. I don't have a space to invite people to, or I can't afford to rent out a laser tag studio. So absolutely. It is nuanced, but I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. Like, we have mechanisms in place. Like, we know, for example, the Canada Child Benefit works. When it was introduced in 2015, you see the rates of child poverty really significantly drop in a way that they hadn't since we've been tracking for the last 30 years. But what's happened is that many families have been left in deep poverty now, right? That benefit tops up at just over $6,000. So if you're just under the poverty line, you're brought right above it. For moms, single mom of 2 kids is on average $13,200 away from the poverty line. That Canada Child Benefit's not going to help her. But if we invest more into that base amount of that program, if we ensure that it's accessible, that it is not, difficult to access, then we're going to start lifting those kids up. So it's nuanced, but there's also these, structures that we have in place that we need to just invest more in. It is a bit of a, what did you say earlier? Like kind of a no-brainer approach. Some of these things, right? We just need that political will, right? It's already a very large program, takes up a important part of the federal budget, but it's not enough at this point.
Okay, so let's go back, because we had touched on this idea of patience, and I already said that I would not be good at your job because I do not have the patience for it. How long are you going to be patient?
As long as it takes. I mean, let me
put it this way. Can we afford for you to be patient? I mean, right?
Okay, that's a different way of putting the question. No, this is families are in crisis, and they have been. You talked about COVID, and that really, people were already so far behind as it was. We have an opportunity now. We're rebuilding, we're in recovery. We need to make sure that we're closing those gaps. People who are in these situations, they don't have the time for me to be patient, right? They are in crisis. They're struggling every day. Yeah. And it's not just kids, right? Like, I think the other big group of folks is people with disabilities. And we're talking about a Canada federal benefit, a new benefit for people with disabilities, but it's not coming until there's 3 years worth of consultation first. But we don't need that consultation, and people who have disabilities can't wait that long. We need to just implement a benefit. There's a lot of data, there's a lot of research, and there's a lot of people who are living with their disabilities who know what they need to be able to access that benefit. And there's lots of recommendations that are out there right now. So no, the government doesn't have time to be patient. They need to act.
Well, and you talk about more study. There's cost in that study, and all it does is compound the cost of having those folks live in poverty. I throw this number out all the time, $33 billion based on Feed Ontario's research prior to the pandemic. That's what it costs Ontario to service the poverty debt in Ontario alone every year. So, that's where I begin to say, holy crap. I mean, again, back to how can we afford not to be addressing this in some real and effective way. And now I appreciate the fact that COVID put a dent in things and stumbled, caused problems. But let's finish on the positive note, because I think that there are lessons learned here. You've already cited a couple of the examples where CERB helped. This is going to elevate and escalate, I think, a conversation around basic or guaranteed income in some form or fashion. We're seeing in the province of Ontario, all four major parties stood up on their hind legs and said, we have to increase ODSP. Now, to varying degrees, and they're all looking at it differently. But for the first time I can remember in this province, all of them are saying this is a priority. It bubbled to the top of the political priority in a campaign, unheard of. So I think that's a positive. So given your lens in terms of our need to better understand or display the issue and find a solution, what do you think? Where are we?
Yeah, you've mentioned the provincial government. I think the relationship between the federal and provincial government's important, and look at what was able to be achieved with childcare. Now we have a national childcare system based on all these bilateral agreements. I think we need more of that kind of federal, provincial working together, especially when it comes to income security programs, to make sure we're not, clawing back where, in the ways in which CERB was clawed back from people who are on ODSP or OW. I think where the federal and provincial governments can work together to be investing in communities, advancing our human rights, that's going to be where we're going to see very substantive change. I think, to me, that's going to be a critical piece.
So, and I'll just finish on this. And when you say sort of that change, or the critical piece in that change, to what extent do we need to change the tone or the vernacular politically around the issue?
I think we need to change it significantly. Right now, there's a lot of, when we talk to the federal government, they say, well, there's only so much we can do. It's now up to the province. And the province says to the federal government, well, this is our jurisdiction. Don't get in our business. I think both of them need to have the goals at front of mind, at top of mind, and that is healthy, thriving communities where people have well-being, they're feeling well, and they're able to thrive. And I'm not even just talking about no poverty, right? I'm talking about being, really able to thrive and deal with all of this kind of trauma and move forward. And I think if different levels of government have that at top of mind, then they're not going to be, getting into those kinds of jurisdictional entanglements. I think that they can find places to work better together.
Well, I mean this in the most positive way. I hope you're out of business sooner than later. So do I. Leila, it's good to talk to you. Thanks for joining us.
Really great to talk to you again, Dave. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the 2030 Project. We would encourage you to subscribe to the show. We're on Apple and Spotify, Google, Audible, pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts. We'd also be grateful if you'd offer a rating on the show. We'd love your thoughts, your feedback, even your criticism. The 2030 Project podcast series is sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. I'm Dave Trafford, and the 2030 Project is a Story Studio Network podcast produced by Eye Contact Productions.